This video is all about the unexpected costs of living in Vancouver. You know that experience when you go to, say, an all-inclusive vacation and they nail you with this hidden resort fee, something that you didn't expect? I mean, after all, it's supposed to be all-inclusive, isn't it? Well, that's the experience I don't want you to have when you move to Vancouver. I want to be sure you're aware of every single thing, and there's a bunch of them that could be nasty surprises when you move here to Vancouver. Let's get into all of the unexpected costs of living in Vancouver right now. My name's Sebastian Albrecht with Living in Vancouver BC team, and welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, this channel is all about moving to and living in Vancouver. I put out videos just like this one every single week. And this week, we're getting into some of the unexpected costs of living in Vancouver. Number one would be earthquake insurance. Yes, we live in an earthquake zone, and my entire life I've been warned about the big one coming. We are well overdue for a massive earthquake here in the southwestern corner of British Columbia. They say every 500 to 600 years one of these comes along. On the Richter scale, over a 9.0. And this is what they call a mega thrust earthquake. We are really overdue for this. And so it's a smart idea. In fact, it's not just a smart idea, it's also required for many of the lenders in the Lower Mainland. When you get a mortgage, they're not only going to require you to have insurance, but also to get earthquake insurance on your property. Now, the thing with this is it obviously costs money. So insurance in Vancouver is going to cost you more than it might in other places. Like if you're moving from Toronto or Halifax, you're not going to be required to have earthquake insurance as you do here in Vancouver. And that earthquake insurance can cost you anywhere from roughly $300-400 to somewhere in the $1,500 to $2,000 range. It really depends on all the bells and whistles, of course. And you do want to shop around. But one thing to keep in mind is the deductible for earthquake insurance is massive. And many of the deductibles are around 100 grand. It's usually a percentage of what is insured, but around 100 grand up to about 20% of the replacement value. So depending on how expensive the property you own is, it can really increase the cost of not just the cost of getting earthquake insurance in the first place, but then also the amount that you're going to have to pay for using that insurance if and when that time comes. Hopefully none of us need to use it in our lifetimes. The nice thing is that there's actually an insurance product that you can insure that deductible with. And that is something that is increasingly being offered. I myself don't have it, but in doing a little bit of research on this topic, I did come across this, and I'm seeing that more and more people in the Lower Mainland are getting it, and it is called Earthquake Insurance Deductible Buy-Down Coverage. So that is definitely something, if you already live here or you're thinking of moving here and you're getting earthquake insurance, be sure to look into that buy-down coverage, because that can go a long way. I mean, honestly, if I had to put $200,000 into rebuilding my house, that might cost $1 million to rebuild. It's gonna hurt an awful lot. And why do I have the insurance in the first place? The number that I've heard is it's somewhere in the $400 or $500 a year range. And just to keep it in line so that you have a good understanding, I myself on my house, my last year's insurance cost $3,200 to insure my house, and the earthquake insurance portion of that was another $400. I would need to pay roughly another $400 on top of that, pay for the earthquake insurance deductible buy-down coverage. So food for thought, and be aware that when you move to Vancouver, you definitely need earthquake insurance. All right, so unexpected cost number two is the cost of gasoline. And something to be aware of, in Metro Vancouver, typically our gasoline is roughly 30% higher in cost than anywhere else in Canada. And so at any point in time, we're paying more here on the west coast of Canada than anywhere else in the country. And the reason for it is twofold. A lot of people don't realize that there's actually two reasons for it. And number one is the production facilities. There is just one refinery in the Lower Mainland supporting the millions of people that live here, and it can't really sustain the kind of demand that we have. So they also use a refinery in Western Washington State that also sends gasoline up here. And we're very much reliant on these two refineries. If anything goes wrong, if they decide that they'd like to charge us more money for one reason or another, but really, if anything goes wrong, if something breaks down or there's a strike of some kind, the price of gasoline goes through the roof really, really quickly, because the source of our supply suddenly dries up, or the cost of that supply suddenly rises pretty astronomically. Now, reason number two is that we're fairly heavily taxed on our gasoline here. Metro Vancouver, the quasi-government organization that oversees the region, roughly 21 municipalities, I believe it is, roughly 3 million people that live in this region. Metro Vancouver taxes gasoline in order to fund our transportation, our transit network, as well as the road network that sort of intertwines the entire region. And this is a very significant amount of tax dollars that comes out of the cost of gasoline. Every time that we're at the pump, we are paying for the roads we drive on, as well as the transit use. And so the idea with transit, of course, and the reason that drivers are paying for it is that it removes people from having to drive on the road, and it makes it easier for us to drive. And that is the way that our system works. So for those two reasons, because of limited production facilities and because of taxation, the cost of gasoline in Vancouver is an unexpected cost that you need to be aware of. I don't just make videos about Vancouver, I also sell real estate in Vancouver. And in fact, I've helped hundreds of families move to Vancouver over my nearly 20 years in this business. I can help you and your family as well. So if you're thinking of moving here, be sure to reach out anytime. If you want help like you're getting from this video, these unexpected costs, if you want to figure out where the right place in Metro Vancouver is for you and your family to reside, be sure to reach out anytime. I am right here standing by. There's never any pressure. It's just a conversation. So when you're ready, I am here. In the meantime, let's get back to the video. Unexpected cost number 3 would be assessments. Now, this is very specific to if you own in a strata, a situation where it's a condo or a townhouse. You share ownership of the same piece of land with a number of other people. It's important to note the way that our system works is different than it works in other markets. And the thing is that this is provincially regulated. So it's very different if you're moving here from another part of Canada, let alone another part of the world. And this is something you really need to be aware of. But culturally, the way that we deal with the expense of maintaining these buildings isn't by sort of a regular monthly payment. And that is the maintenance fee. We do have those. Now, you do have to pay those when you live in a strata. So you're covering the regular expenses like the heat and the lighting in common areas like janitors and gardeners and regular property management and all of that kind of thing. There is also a portion that goes into a savings account called the Contingency Reserve Fund. Now, this amount is relatively small to the cost and expenses involved in maintaining and repairing a strata. And I do liken always owning a home to owning a car. You know, you can't just drive a car into the ground. You don't want to just drive a car right into the ground, right? You take it to the mechanic. You make sure that it's finely tuned and it's running well. And there's certain elements of your car that are going to break down over time. Well, that's the same thing as owning a house, right? There's going to be elements of your home. And in this case, we're talking about condo buildings and townhouse units where over time, these things wear out and need to be replaced, like a roof, like the plumbing, like the parquet membrane, like the elevator. So over a period of time, these things are going to need to be replaced and you're going to need to spend money to do that. Well, in other markets, they do a better job, I would say, taking money out of the maintenance fee, thereby also having a higher maintenance fee than we typically have here in Metro Vancouver, but having that money get paid for through the maintenance fee on a regular basis. And then 20 years down the road, you don't have to do a call to all the owners as an assessment and come knocking on their door for more money because you've already saved it. Well, in our market, that's not typically the way it works. And that is something you should really be aware of. When you buy a property here, you can have these what to many people appear to be a surprise. I mean, I feel like what you need to be doing is just paying attention to what's going on in the building. It's not a surprise if you come to it with the realization that buildings do fall out of disrepair over time, that elements in the building need to be replaced. There are things like a depreciation report and engineering reports where you can get feeling for where the building is at. And of course, you also need a good realtor to be helping you determine where the building is in its sort of timeline and how far the expenses that might be coming up as you own this property. So all of those things can help you avoid surprises. Those are really nasty. But what you do need to be aware is that the likelihood is that there will be assessments down the road when you own in a strata, whether it's a condo or a townhouse. And then really the way to manage that is start saving yourself. So if you move in today and you know that in 5 years or 10 years, they're likely to need a new roof, don't leave it to the last minute. Start saving today. Do your own maintenance fee. Put that money aside every single month. And then when they come knocking on your door 5 to 10 years later, you have it. That's the way to solve the problem. But it's just an important reminder of the way our system has a different culture, and assessments are really part of the way that buildings are run and stratas are run typically. Not every case, but more often than not, you will be asked for money down the road to help maintain the building that you live in. Unexpected expense number 4 is the cost of really doing anything. And by anything, I mean a renovation or building a new home. And it really is shocking how expensive it is here. I mean, I really noticed it when a few years ago when I was watching HGTV, and they're showing people flipping houses in, I don't know, Houston, Texas or Atlanta, Georgia, and they're renovating an entire house for $30,000. In Vancouver, the last time it cost $30,000 to renovate a house was maybe 1965. Maybe it was 78, but it was a long time ago, and you and I were both very, very young. The reality of doing any kind of work in Vancouver now is that it's going to cost you more than you expect. I have found in the city of Vancouver, you really can't do anything under $1,500. Nobody's going to want to show up unless they're getting paid at least that kind of money. Whether it's a plumber or an electrician or a handyman, there needs to be sort of a significant amount of work. And speaking of handyman, finding a handyman that's willing to do a small job on a house or a condo or whatever it is that you own in Vancouver or anywhere that's very close to the center of Vancouver is really, really challenging. And the main reason in my opinion, that these expenses are so high is so many of the people who do this kind of work don't tend to live in Vancouver. And so they live in a place like Coquitlam or in Surrey or in Delta, and for them to be willing to make the commute, to drive into the city an hour each way and do the work for you, they need to charge a premium. They need to make it worth their while, right? So about 50 years ago, people doing that kind of work were all within the city. And so as a result, it all cost a lot less. But it's not just the handyman and that type of thing. It's also just building a house is incredibly expensive, doing any significant renovation. So these days, in order to build a house in the city of Vancouver, the ballpark figures that I'm hearing are sort of starting at about $300 a square foot and going up to $600, $700 a square foot, even more. Really, the sky ends up being the limit, because if you want all of your faucets gold plated, well, obviously that's going to drive up the expense. But a bare bones sort of construction is typically that the quoted number is usually down around $300 a square foot, and that is tough to stick to. It is like you need to be very smart about spending all of the money that you're spending here. And quite often that drifts, to $400, $450, $500. And then sort of a little more luxurious, you're probably okay in the $600, $650 range. But that is the range. It is incredibly expensive. If you're building a 3,000 square foot house, obviously, you're talking about $1 to $2 million just for the construction costs. That's nothing. We're not even talking about the cost of the land, which, to be frank, is also an incredibly significant part of the equation. You could be paying anywhere from $1.5 million to $3 million just for a piece of land, on top of which you need to then pay all of the construction expenses. Now, part of the reason that this is all expensive is everybody basically has their hand out. Everybody is in there charging money to the people that are building. And fair enough. There is room for, I'm a free enterprise kind of guy. If people are looking to make money, well, there is opportunity to do that. But one area that I always am shocked at is the city is how horrible it is, how expensive our city is. And on the other end, they are charging astronomical fees for construction. And so as an example, to build a new house in Vancouver, you are looking at just development permits, $30,000 for a single family house. And it goes as high, let me get this right. Yeah, that's right. For a high-rise condo in Vancouver, it's the most expensive development permit in all of Canada. It's $125,000. It's no wonder that basically in recent years, the only things that have been built in the city of Vancouver are luxury condos that are over $1 million. And I'm talking about like a one bedroom. For low-rise condos, the development fee is $61,000. So you're looking at anywhere from $30,000 to $125,000 per unit in the city of Vancouver. And it varies throughout Metro Vancouver. Some are higher and some are lower. But for the most part, you're looking at similar expenses that are contributing to the cost of home ownership and the cost of maintaining your home. And that's something I think that a lot of people aren't aware of, and also an unexpected cost. If you come here thinking that you're going to do sort of a bare bones reno based on numbers that you're familiar with in Northern Ontario, as an example, you want to be aware that it's likely to cost considerably more when you come here to Vancouver. Unexpected cost number 5 would be parking. And Parking really depends on where you are, but if you're coming into the city of Vancouver and you want to go downtown, as an example, street parking can cost you anywhere from $1 to $11 an hour. $11 an hour. That is insane to me. You can also, there's areas in Vancouver that parking is still free, but more and more, not just in the city of Vancouver, but it's cities like Burnaby and Coquitlam and Richmond and New West, there's less and less free parking. This is one of the ways that cities are gaining revenue. They need to cover their expenses, and the land is expensive. One of the ways that this has been argued about in the past is why do we assume that the street real estate is free? We do need to pay for it, unfortunately, and by paying for it, we also start to make using vehicles less and less convenient and less desirable. So more often people look at alternatives. And to be frank, I look at alternatives when I go downtown Vancouver, as an example. I might decide that an Uber might be better rather than driving and paying $11 an hour, or taking the SkyTrain or something like that. So it means maybe for certain trips that there are less cars on the road. I am all on board for that. The other thing is where there are certain areas in the city where there isn't just a free-for-all for parking. You have to be a resident to be able to park on the street in those areas. And typically those are in high density areas like in Cole Harbour, in the West End, in Yaletown, but it could also be in areas along SkyTrain routes. So there are areas along Cambie, as an example, that it is only local parking, and the result is you have to pay for that privilege. If you live on those streets, you can go to the city, you get a parking permit, but the cost of that parking permit can be anywhere from as low as $63 a year in Oak Ridge, up to roughly double that in the West End. It's $126 a year. A monthly parking pass can be anywhere in the range of $150, let's say, sort of in the outskirts in a suburb, $200 as you're getting into the city, and closer to $300 in downtown Vancouver. Keep in mind, fewer and fewer of those old parking garages are around. I mean, I remember as a kid, downtown Vancouver was basically kind of a giant parking lot, and those parking lots were everywhere. That's no longer the case as more and more development has happened. It's sort of a holding property for a developer usually. They just build a parking garage or have sort of surface level parking and charge parking. So less and less of that is around, but it's something to keep in mind that it is available and can be part of the cost of commuting if it's not part of what's provided by your employer. And then on top of that, just so you're aware, you can also purchase parking, and parking is, I know that in Hong Kong, as an example, that's one of the cities that's actually more expensive than Vancouver. I've heard of parking spots that have traded for $300,000 plus, and people actually invest in parking stalls in Hong Kong. In Vancouver, for the most part, these parking stalls, they exist and people do buy and sell them, but mostly you can only buy and sell them within your strata. So it's 1333 West Georgia. If you own a parking stall, you can't sell it to somebody that lives at 1415 West Georgia. You have to sell it to somebody who lives at 1333 West Georgia. And the cost of these parking spots, as a result of that limitation, I would say it's not probably the best long-term investment, but if you live in the property and you don't have a parking stall, it absolutely is an excellent investment, especially as more and more buildings are built without parking, and it becomes less of a requirement of development on the part of the cities, not just Vancouver, but other cities are following suit. In Vancouver, you can typically expect that the value of a parking spot is somewhere in the $35,000 to $55,000 range. There's certainly some, they might be in more exclusive buildings or larger stalls that get up to maybe $75,000. Occasionally you might see something around $30,000, but it's in that ballpark is what you're going to be paying for parking. So as you can see, parking is expensive, and this is another one of those unexpected expenses. Next, we're talking property transfer tax. This is something that can come as a real shock for people that are coming from other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Now, when you purchase a property in British Columbia, every single time you have to pay property transfer tax. This is money that goes to the provincial government. It's an enormous revenue source. It was brought in the early 80s, I believe it was. Originally, this was supposed to be a tax on the wealthy. It was pinned at 1% on the first 200,000 in value and 2% on the balance. And at the time, something like 98% of properties in British Columbia were valued under $200,000. So everybody thought, no big deal, it's only 1%. We're not worried about this. Well, at this point, basically there are no properties in the Lower Mainland worth under $200,000. But not only that, they also raised in recent years the property transfer tax. So you pay 1% on the first $200,000, then you pay 2% on the portion between 200,000 and 2 million. And then you pay 3% on the portion between 2 million and 3 million. And then on the portion above 3 million, you pay an additional 2%. So you're paying 5% on the value over $3 million. Once again, this is a considerable amount of money. It is an unexpected cost if you're coming here from somewhere else and you had no idea about this. But also notice that the government once again didn't index this to inflation. So when they increased these amounts, nobody really batted an eye because for most people, it doesn't affect them. Today, most properties in Vancouver aren't worth more than $3 million or even $5 million. But 30 years from now, my belief would be that more than likely we're going to see a considerably increasing amount of property in Vancouver worth more than $5 million or around $5 million. And we're all going to be paying an astronomical amount of tax on the purchase of those properties. And once again, the government is saying we want to make property more affordable, and yet they increase the cost of said properties. So that's me on my soapbox. I'll get off my soapbox now, but also something to be aware of is if you are a foreign buyer, we do have a foreign buyer ban in Canada. And so unfortunately, if you're not a Canadian citizen and you don't have permanent residency, you're not allowed to purchase in the fall of 2024. You're not allowed to purchase property anywhere in Canada. However, there is a big giant loophole in that, and that is if you're on a work visa. So if you're here and working on a work visa, no problem, then you are able to buy. There's also an exception for students that is a much tougher exception in the Lower Mainland. The property has to be worth less than $500,000. So that's not really, there aren't very many buyers that would qualify in that way in Metro Vancouver. So assuming that you are on a work visa, if you are a foreign buyer, and it's okay for you to purchase in Metro Vancouver and you want to purchase, you are hit with the foreign buyer tax. And this is not a federal tax, this is a provincial tax. And it's an additional property transfer tax, essentially. The locals have to buy the property transfer tax that I mentioned. But if you are a foreign buyer, if you are not a Canadian citizen and you are not a permanent resident, then unfortunately you are gonna have to pay 20% tax on your purchase. And that one exception is if you are in the BC Provincial Nominee Program. That is something, if you are looking to move here, if your employer wants to move you here, or if you're being headhunted to come to Vancouver, that is definitely something that you should try and fight for if you're interested in owning real estate in a relatively short period of time in Metro Vancouver. But again, unexpected expenses, both the property transfer tax and the foreign buyer tax, things you really do need to be aware of if you're looking on moving to Vancouver and purchasing property. Okay, so now we're going to talk about property taxes. Now this is different and a little bit confusing from property transfer tax. That happens just when you purchase a property, but the property taxes are something that you have to pay every single year. And if you've heard me talk in other videos about this, I talk pretty frequently about how property taxes in Metro Vancouver are very reasonable. There's, in the grand scheme of things, in the scope of Canada, in North America, property taxes on a valuation basis are relatively low in Metro Vancouver. And they can be 2 to 3 times higher in other parts of Canada. So that's one way that you can actually save a little bit of money and might be an unexpected savings when you move to Vancouver. But what is not is if you own a more expensive property. And this is another one of those sneaky little taxes. There is something called the additional school tax rate. And so school taxes are part of your property taxes. We all pay for schools when we pay our property taxes. But a few years ago, the government increased that amount for only certain properties, again targeting the luxury property that is over $3 million. So between $3 million and $4 million, you're paying an additional 0.2% of tax. This works out to roughly $2,000 on a $3.5 million property, additional to what you're already paying in property taxes. On assessed values over $4 million, you're paying an additional 0.4%. So on a $5.5 million property, you're paying a whopping $8,000 extra in this additional school tax rate. And this, once again, similar to the property transfer tax, was not indexed to inflation. So it's going to stay there. It's going to stay starting at $3 million and go up to 4, and from 4 million on for generations and decades. And one day, more and more of us are going to be paying that particular tax. And this is another one, if you're looking at that luxury market, something that you want to be aware of, that you're going to be paying some extra taxes. And the last thing I want to talk about is the speculation tax and the empty homes tax. Now, these are two separate taxes. The speculation tax, we'll begin with that one. That applies to the province of British Columbia in the more densely populated areas. Basically anywhere in Greater Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver, in the Lower Mainland, this tax applies. And what it means is they want every property that is owned to be lived in. And there was a time there was some concern that this wasn't happening. So if you want the privilege of having a vacation home in Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver, well, you're going to have to pay for that privilege. And for Canadians or permanent residents, that tax annually is 0.5 percentage point. But if you're non-Canadian, it's 2%. And what the bar is basically that you need someone living in that property at least half the year, at least 180 days, roughly 6 months out of the year. And if you do, then you can be exempt from this tax. Now, that is the provincial tax, but if you live specifically in the city of Vancouver, this tax only applies to property in the city of Vancouver and not Metro Vancouver. It's the empty homes tax. And this was actually first instituted. The speculation tax came afterwards. But the empty homes tax is also very similar in that they want property not empty. They want it to be rented out if you're not living in it. They don't want Vancouver to be a city of second homes and vacation property. If you are not exempt from this tax, unfortunately, you will be hit with a 3% tax. And both of these taxes, I should mention, are based on your annual assessed value. And so if your property is $1 million, is worth $1 million, well, you're being hit $30,000 by the empty homes tax. And if you're a foreign national, the speculation tax would be $20,000. And that can be a very significant expense. Now, if you are thinking of looking for a vacation home in the Metro Vancouver area, perhaps you live on the Sunshine Coast and you'd like to keep a pied-à-terre in downtown Vancouver, I would not recommend it because you have the ultra-high empty homes tax. But maybe you decide then, instead, I'll be in Lower Lonsdale. And you would not be hit by the empty homes tax, but you would be hit by the speculation tax. But as a Canadian, you would only be paying 0.5% interest. And that might be an expense that you're willing to take in order to have the luxury of having these two properties. And there are some people who will do that. They'll have a place in Vancouver that they use as a primary residence, and then they use, maybe they have a place in the Sunshine Coast or on one of the Gulf Islands. And they can't have them both as primary residences. You can't split them between spouses, but what they will do is pay the speculation tax on the secondary property that's outside of Vancouver. And the unexpected costs of having vacation homes and second homes in Vancouver and in Metro Vancouver. So it's not all just unexpected expenses, of course. I hope at this point I've sort of shed the light on these unexpected expenses, and none of this is going to come as a surprise now to you moving to Vancouver or moving within Vancouver. I mean, there's a lot of people who live here as well who aren't aware of these things. But as you can tell, I'm very much interested in making sure that I put this information in your hands so that you can make the right decision. But when you're ready to make the right decision about a real estate agent, be sure to reach out to me. I am an agent that has helped hundreds of families move to and within Vancouver over my 18-year career. I can help you, of course, as well. Whenever you're ready, my contact information is right there on the screen. In the meantime, I've got dozens and dozens of videos that you really do have to check out. This is all a bunch of content that I've put together to help make the transition for you to Vancouver smoother and easier. Really do a deep dive on all this content. I've been putting out this content for about 2 years now, every single week, and there is a ton of good value here that I think you are really, really going to enjoy. Make sure that you spend a lot of time diving through all that content. But there's also a couple of videos that I did just recently that I think you're really, really going to enjoy. This video over here is all about my personal cost of living in Vancouver. Check out that if you're curious about my situation, how that might apply to you. And then be sure to check this video out, all about Vancouver's hottest neighborhood, a neighborhood I think you might want to have a look at and interact with that neighborhood along with me in this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on next week's video.